There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a palace when its most beloved figure is no longer seen at the gates. Not the silence of absence. Something heavier. The silence of a nation holding its breath, not daring to ask the question it already knows the answer to, not daring to say the word it has heard whispered in corridors and coffee shops and living rooms from Edinburgh to Cornwall. That silence lasted months. And then, on a gray January morning in 2025, Catherine, Princess of Wales, wife, mother of three, woman who had spent 2 decades learning how to carry the weight of a crown she had never been born into, sat before a camera and said the word herself. Cancer. She said it plainly. No trembling. No performance of strength. Just a woman at 42, looking directly into the lens, telling the world something it had suspected and feared and hoped was not true. The nation did not exhale. It wept. But this story does not begin with illness. It begins, as all real stories do, long before the moment of reckoning, in the years that built the woman who would one day sit in that chair, steady-voiced, and refuse to be undone. Catherine Elizabeth Middleton was born on the 9th of January, 1982, in Reading, Berkshire, the eldest child of Michael and Carol Middleton. Her father was a flight dispatcher. Her mother sold party supplies from a kitchen table before that kitchen table became a company worth millions. They were not aristocracy. They were not old money. They were a family that believed in showing up, in working hard without making noise about it, in giving their children a childhood that felt like solid ground. Catherine grew up with that solid ground under her feet. She played field hockey. She studied art history. She was the kind of girl who made things with her hands, who sewed, who baked, who painted, and who moved through the world with a quietness that people sometimes mistook for shyness, but was actually something closer to attention. She was paying attention. Always. She met Prince William at the University of St. Andrews in 2001. She was 19. He was 19. They were both far from home in the way that only university makes possible, untethered just enough to become themselves before the world decided who they were going to be. Their friendship became something else gradually, the way real things do, without announcement. By the time the British tabloids had discovered there was a story to tell, the story was already years deep. The years between that discovery and their wedding in April 2011 were not kind ones. The press treated Catherine with a particular cruelty reserved for women who dare to exist in proximity to powerful men without yet having the title that would make them untouchable. They called her Weighty Katie. They photographed her without permission in moments of ordinary privacy and dressed those photographs up as public interest. They questioned her ambition, her education, her worthiness. She did not respond. She finished her degree. She worked. She waited. Not passively, but with the patience of someone who understood that the ground she was standing on was real, even when the noise around her suggested otherwise. On the 29th of April, 2011, she married Prince William in Westminster Abbey in front of an estimated 2 billion people. She wore a dress she had helped design. She walked down the aisle of one of the most photographed buildings in the world with the composure of a woman who had been practicing composure her entire life. She became Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge. The world fell in love with her the way it sometimes falls in love with people it has been unkind to, all at once, all in, as if the unkindness had never happened. The decade that followed was one of construction. She built a public role for material that did not come with instructions. There was no handbook for what she was becoming. She focused on children, their early years, the science of the first 5 years of development, the invisible architecture of mental health that gets laid down before a child learns to read. She launched surveys. She created programs. She got on the floor with toddlers in community centers and did not look like a woman performing her duties. She looked like a woman who cared about toddlers. The distinction matters. People can tell the difference. She had 3 children. George, born in July 2013. Charlotte, born in May 2015. Louis, born in April 2018. She photographed them herself each year, not with royal photographers, not with careful staging, but with her own camera, her own eye, on the lawn of their home or in the light of an ordinary afternoon. The photographs circulated the world, and people loved them not because they were technically perfect, but because they were warm. They looked like a family, a real one. In September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died. The world Catherine had entered as a 29-year-old bride shifted beneath her feet. William became Prince of Wales. She became Princess of Wales. The titles they had inherited from grief now pointed toward a future that was no longer distant. The crown that would one day come to William, and to her, beside him, was no longer an abstraction. It was the next chapter. They moved to Windsor. They enrolled the children in new schools. They began the work of becoming what they would one day be. And then, in the winter of 2023, something went wrong. The details came slowly, as details of illness always do. First, a hospitalization in January 2024 for what was described as planned abdominal surgery. Then weeks of silence. Then the photograph that shook the world, a Mother's Day image released by the palace that had been digitally altered, badly, in ways that were visible to anyone who looked closely. The photograph was pulled, apologized for, explained as an amateur editing mistake. The explanation satisfied no one. The speculation about what was being hidden, about what the palace was protecting, grew louder by the day. On the 22nd of March, 2024, Catherine sat before a camera in the garden of Adelaide Cottage and filmed a video message that would be watched hundreds of millions of times before the sun set that day. She said she had been diagnosed with cancer following her January surgery. She said she was undergoing preventative chemotherapy. She said she was taking things one day at a time. She asked for privacy for herself and her children. She said she was well and getting stronger. She said all of this without her voice breaking once. The silence that followed was not the hell-breath silence from before. It was different, softer, the kind of silence that settles when a large number of people decide, all at once, to be decent. The tabloids went quiet. The speculation stopped. The world, which had spent months inventing stories about what might be wrong, had no language adequate for the reality of what was. A woman, 42 years old, 3 children under 11, a diagnosis she had not asked for and had not deserved, a public role that demanded she tell the world about the most private thing that had ever happened to her, and a composure in the telling of it that seemed to come from somewhere so deep and so settled inside her that no amount of fear could reach it. That composure had been a long time in the making. The months that followed her announcement were months of withdrawal. She stepped back from public duties. She was seen occasionally at Trooping the Color in June 2024, thinner, careful, wearing a green dress in the June heat with 3 children beside her, and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes in the way her smiles usually did, but reached there eventually by the end of the day. She attended Wimbledon, a tournament she loved with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone who had never learned to pretend not to care about things she cared about. She was photographed by her own husband laughing on a farm in the summer of 2024. The photograph ran everywhere. It was the most commented upon royal photograph in years, not because anything dramatic was happening in it, but because she looked like herself again. Just herself, laughing on a farm. In September 2024, she announced that her chemotherapy had ended, that she was in remission, that she was returning to her duties carefully and gradually, guided by what her body would allow. The announcement was quiet. No fanfare, no stajamomen, a brief statement, and then she got back to work. The work she returned to was different from the work she had left. She had always cared about mental health. She had always understood, in the intellectual way of someone who had studied and researched and sat with experts, that the early years of childhood laid foundations that determined everything that came after. Now she understood it differently. She had spent 9 months inside her own body's most frightening season. She had watched her children watch her be ill. She knew now, from the inside, what it felt like when the ground beneath you stopped being solid, and what it actually took, not in theory, but in flesh and bone and terror, to stand on it anyway. She came back changed. Not broken. Changed. There's a difference that matters enormously. By the time her 44th birthday arrived on the 9th of January, 2026, Catherine, Princess of Wales, had been many things to many people. An object of tabloid cruelty, a fairy tale bride, a new mother photographed on hospital steps, a woman in a green dress at a royal balcony trying to hold it together, a voice on a garden video telling the world she had cancer, a photograph on a farm laughing in the summer sun. She had been all of these things in public, for everyone to see, with no privacy to absorb the shock of any of them. What she had never been in all those years and all those incarnations was defeated. Her 44th year had not yet revealed what it was going to ask of her. The year was young. January was cold. But the woman who stood at the threshold of it had been tested in every way a life could test a person. And she had not only survived, she had become, in the surviving, something the country had not quite had words for yet. It was about to find them. January in Windsor is a particular kind of cold. Not the dramatic, story-worthy cold of a country that expects snow and gets it, but the damp, gray, bone-settling cold of an island that has been cold so long it has forgotten what it was like to be anything else. The trees along the long walk stand stripped and patient in it. The light arrives late and leaves early, as if it has somewhere better to be. Inside Adelaide Cottage, the fires were lit early. The children were back in school. The rhythms of a new year, the ordinary, unglamorous rhythms of packed lunches and homework and what's for dinner, had resumed. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was 44 years old. The birthday passed without ceremony, as her birthdays often did. She was not a woman who needed a birthday to feel like an occasion. She was a woman who made Tuesdays feel like occasions, who found the interesting thing in the ordinary moment, who turned a school run into a conversation worth having, who could spend an afternoon with a group of 5-year-olds playing with paint and look, at the end of it, as if she had been given a gift rather than done one. This was not performance. This was constitution. She was wired, in some fundamental way, toward presence, toward paying attention to the thing directly in front of her rather than the thing 3 steps ahead that might require managing. It was this quality, more than any title or gown or carefully choreographed walkabout, that had earned her the country's trust. The country's trust was not a small thing. It was not the reflexive loyalty that attaches to crowns by default, the automatic deference of a population to its symbols. Catherine had never inspired that kind of feeling. What she inspired was something more uncomfortable and more real. The feeling people get when they watch someone navigate something genuinely hard with genuine grace and think involuntarily, I want to be more like that. The feeling of being seen by someone who is not performing seeing. The feeling of a handshake that means what a handshake is supposed to mean. She had been building this trust for nearly 15 years. And in her 44th year, she was about to do something with it that no one had done before in quite this way. The program she brought back to, with the full force of her returned energy, was called Shaping Us, a national conversation, years in the making about the first 5 years of a child's life and the way those years determine everything. The science behind it was not new. Developmental psychologists have been saying for decades that the architecture of a human personality, its capacity for empathy, its ability to regulate emotion, its resilience in the face of difficulty, is laid down before a child can read a single word. What was new was the way Catherine chose to talk about it. Not as policy, not as statistics, not as the kind of public health initiative that produces white papers no one reads and ribbon cuttings that generate a single day of press coverage before disappearing into the machinery of good intentions. She talked about it as what it was. A human thing, a mother thing, a thing that happened in kitchens and bedrooms and back gardens and school corridors in the unremarkable dailiness of raising small people who did not yet know they were being shaped. She filmed visits to family hubs, community centers in parts of the country where the distance between a family in crisis and the support it needed was measured not in miles, but in the invisible currency of knowing where to go and believing when you got there that anyone would care. She sat with mothers who had been alone in their difficulty. She sat with fathers who had not been taught how to be present because no one had been present for them. She sat with grandparents raising grandchildren because the generation in between had been swallowed by something no family had expected to survive. She sat with all of them, and she listened, and her listening was not the theatrical, nodding, clock-watching listening of a public figure executing a duty. It was the listening of someone who had, in the past 2 years, learned something about what it meant to be inside a difficulty that no amount of privilege could solve. She had been inside the thing. That mattered. People knew it. They could feel the difference between someone asking questions from the outside and someone asking from a place of having been at least partially on the same side of the wall they were on. The programs she launched in her 44th year were not single-ribbon events. They were sustained, quiet, structural work. She partnered with universities. She commissioned research. She brought the data into rooms where decisions about public funding were made, and she made the data impossible to dismiss because she had made the human beings behind it impossible to dismiss first. She introduced the data to the face that went with it, and the face was always someone she had met in a family hub or a school corridor or a community hall, someone whose name she remembered, someone she asked after in the next meeting, and the one after that. This was the mechanism. This was how change moved through her. Not through speeches, not through statements, through the sustained, unglamorous, deeply human work of staying in the room. The country watched all of this the way it watches things it does not quite have the vocabulary for, a little hungrily, a little uncertainly, not entirely sure what it was seeing, but sure that it was seeing something real. The usual metrics of royal popularity, crowd sizes, press attention, public approval ratings, told part of the story. But the part they could not quantify was the quality of the attention she received. The way people in the rooms with her seemed to exhale. The way conversations that had been braced for a formality relaxed into something else. The way children, who were the most honest audience on earth, did not perform for her. They just played. Her own children were growing. George was 12, long-limbed, and serious in the way of boys who feel the weight of what is coming without yet having the words for it. Charlotte was 10, Catherine made small. Same bone structure, same directness, the same quality of attention that her mother had, the slightly unnerving sense that she was tracking everything in the room simultaneously and filing it away for later. Louis was 7, still in the unself-conscious years, still capable of doing something spectacularly odd at a public event, and finding it hilarious, still the one who made his mother laugh the way only the youngest child can make a parent laugh, without trying, without knowing they're doing it, by simply being exactly themselves. Catherine photographed all 3 of them. She always did. Her photographs of her children had become a quiet tradition of their own, a counterpoint to the staged, formal imagery that royalty typically produced of itself. A reminder that behind the ceremonial there was a family, and behind the family there were specific people with specific faces caught in specific moments of being alive. The photograph she released on George's 12th birthday showed a boy on the edge of something, a little taller than anyone expected, looking at the camera with an expression that was his father's around the eyes, and something entirely his own in the set of his jaw. The internet spent a week being moved by a birthday photograph, which said something about what Catherine had built in the years she had spent pointing a camera at her children and choosing to share what she found. She was also, in her 44th year, doing something she had not done enough of in the years before illness rearranged her priorities. She was resting, not in the performative way of someone who has been told by a doctor to rest and is grudgingly complying. Resting in the way of someone who has understood, from the inside, that the body is not a machine to be pushed past its limits and expected to keep giving. She walked. She spent time in the natural world, the gardens, the trees, the particular quality of light that comes through English woodland in the early spring when everything is beginning again and the green is so new it looks almost impossible. She had always been a person who needed the outdoors, who moved differently when there was sky overhead and ground underfoot. Now she moved through it with something that looked from outside like gratitude. Not the performed gratitude of someone who knows they're supposed to be grateful. The real kind. the kind that comes from having been close enough to losing something to understand what it would have meant to lose it. William watched all of this. He had watched her for 25 years, through university and press cruelty and a wedding scene by 2 billion people and 3 children and the death of his grandmother and a cancer diagnosis that he had absorbed with a face that gave almost nothing away in public while privately, according to those closest to them, it had taken something from him that he was still in the process of getting back. He was not a demonstrative man in public. He was his father's son in that way, contained, careful, aware of the optics of every moment. But in the year Catherine turned 44, there were photographs taken at events, at walkabouts, in the margins of official engagements, in which he looked at her the way people look at things they almost lost and didn't. Not with the glazed sentimentality of a greeting card, with something much more specific. The look of a person who has had the future shown to them in the wrong version and who cannot quite stop checking, even now, that the right version is still holding. It was still holding. By the spring of her 44th year, the conversations in the relevant rooms, the rooms where honors are discussed, where history is assessed, with a question of how a nation formally recognizes exceptional service is asked and answered, had been going on for some time. The criteria for the award being considered were not simple ones. The Royal Victorian Order, at its highest level, is not given for doing the job that was expected. It is given for doing something more than that, for bringing something to the role that the role did not require, but that transformed the role in the giving, for service that was, in the language of the honors process, exceptional. The case being made was not difficult to make. What Catherine had done in her years as Princess of Wales, and before that as Duchess of Cambridge, and before that as the woman who was becoming what she was going to be, was not easily summarized by a list of programs launched or patronages held or miles walked in official capacity. The list was long, and the list mattered, but the list was not the thing. The thing was harder to point to. It was the quality of presence she had brought to every room she had been in. The way she had used her visibility not to maintain an image, but to direct attention toward the people and issues and truths that needed it. The way she had, in the hardest year of her life, turned her own illness into a moment of national conversation about vulnerability and strength and what it means to be seen, really seen, in your difficulty. She had not asked for that role. It had been given to her by circumstance, by the particular cruelty of being ill in public, in a position where the public had a stake in your health that felt, sometimes, more like ownership than care. She had taken what circumstance gave her and made something out of it that no one could have scripted and no one could have manufactured. The recommendation moved through the channels it needed to move through. The king reviewed it. The approval came. Catherine did not know yet what was coming. She was in a family hub in Bradford, sitting on the floor with a 2-year-old who was explaining something extremely important about a yellow truck, nodding with the focused seriousness of someone receiving genuinely important information, when her phone, face down in her coat pocket, received a notification she would not read until later that evening. She would read it in the kitchen at Adelaide Cottage, the children in bed, the house quiet in the way houses are quiet after children have finished filling them. She would read it standing up, still in her coat, and she would stand there for a moment after reading it, not moving, not speaking, with an expression that the one person in the room with her, her husband, described later, privately, as the expression of a person who has just been told that something they did in the dark, when no one was watching, when they were doing it because they believed in it, and not because anyone was going to notice, has been noticed. The award was not just an honor. It was a sentence, a declaration from her country about who she had been and what that had been worth. She read it twice. She looked up. "Right," she said. And then she took her coat off and made tea. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Official correspondence from the palace always arrived in the same cream-colored envelopes, carrying the same quiet weight of institution. But this one was different in the way that certain envelopes are different before you open them. Thicker somehow, more deliberate, like it had been folded with specific intention. Catherine already knew what it contained. She had been told. And yet the envelope sat on the kitchen table in Adelaide Cottage for 20 minutes before she opened it. While she made coffee, she didn't drink, and George asked twice about his geography project, and Louis staged a protest about the concept of shoes in general. Ordinary life did not pause for historic moments. This was something Catherine had learned early and understood deeply. The world's camera could be on you at one moment, and your 7-year-old could be demanding pancakes at the next. And both things were equally real and equally demanding of your full attention. And the capacity to move between them without breaking the thread of either was not a talent. It was a discipline, one she had been practicing for 20 years. She opened the letter after school drop-off, standing at the kitchen counter, mug in hand, the house finally quiet. The formal conferment of the Dame Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, the highest rank of the order, the most personal gift a sovereign can bestow, given not through political committee, but at the direct discretion of the monarch, was contained in language that was precise and ceremonial and very old. The language had been used before for other people in other years, but it had never been used for someone who was 44 years old and had spent 2 of those years fighting cancer in the pages of every newspaper in the world. It had never been used for someone whose most significant contribution to the institution had not been a single act or a single program, but something far more diffuse and far more powerful. The sustained, consistent, daily act of being genuinely present in a role that would have been perfectly survivable on performance alone. The Royal Victorian Order is personal. That is the operative word. Other honors flow through government, through nomination committees, through the machinery of official recognition. The Royal Victorian Order flows from the crown. It is the sovereign's direct expression of personal gratitude. What it says, stripped of the formal language, is, I noticed. Not the institution. Me. I saw what you did, and I want you to know that it mattered. King Charles, who had his own complicated understanding of what it cost to spend a life in service to an institution that demanded everything and explained nothing, had seen it. He had watched his daughter-in-law navigate the worst year of her life with a grace that was not born of comfort or distance, but of genuine engagement. He had watched her come back. He had watched her return to the work, not with the diminished energy of someone still recovering, but with the sharpened focus of someone who had understood, in the course of her illness, exactly why the work mattered, and exactly what it was for. He had signed the warrant himself. The investiture ceremony was held in a private room at Windsor Castle on a Thursday morning in early spring, when the grounds were beginning to show the first tentative green of a season arriving on schedule after a long winter. The room was not one of the grand ceremonial spaces, not the throne room or the Waterloo chamber with their gilt and their portraits and their weight of historical performance. It was smaller, more like a room in which something real could happen. The king stood. Catherine stood opposite him. William stood to one side, not performing the occasion, just present for it, the way he was present for everything now, with a quality of attention that had changed in the past 2 years, sharpened and quieted simultaneously. There were no cameras. There was no live stream. This was not a moment made for the public record. It was made for the 2 people at the center of it. The sovereign who wanted a member of his family to know that her service had been exceptional, and the woman receiving that recognition who had, for most of her adult life, given her service in the knowledge that it would be seen and rarely in the knowledge that it would be understood. It was understood now. The ceremony said so in every gesture and every word. When the insignia was placed, Catherine's expression was the expression of a person receiving something they had not realized they needed until it arrived. Not surprise, not performance, something quieter. The look of a woman who had spent the better part of 2 years asking herself, in the private hours, whether the life she had chosen, the visibility, the sacrifice of ordinary privacy, the constant calibration of self in public, had been worth what it had cost. The look of someone receiving, in a single gesture, a clear answer to a question she had stopped expecting to be answered. The king said something to her quietly, between the formal words of the ceremony. It was not for the record. It will not be reported. But those in the room described Catherine nodding once, very slightly, with the expression of someone who has just had something confirmed that they suspected was true, but needed, in this particular year, to hear from a source that could not be doubted. She wore the insignia on the lapel of her coat when she arrived at a family hub in South London 4 days later. She wore it without announcement. The staff noticed it. One of them, a young woman who ran the infant feeding group on Tuesday mornings and had never in her life expected to be in a room with a princess, asked about it because asking was the kind of thing you did in a family hub, because the whole point of a family hub was that the hierarchy of the outside world was not in effect inside these walls, because Catherine had worked hard to make it that way. Catherine explained what it was, briefly, without the kind of elaboration that turns a personal thing into a public speech. She explained what the order was, what it meant, who gave it. And then, the young woman, 26 years old, 2 children, first time she had used a family hub, still not entirely sure she was allowed to be there, said something that Catherine repeated later to William, word for word, from memory, which was not something she often did. So the king just gave you that because he wanted to, not because someone told him to. Yes, Catherine said, because he wanted to. The young woman looked at the insignia for a moment. That's a bit lovely, isn't it? She said, in the tone of someone who has encountered an unexpectedly decent thing in a world that does not always produce them. And then she went back to her feeding group, and Catherine went back to the toddler room, and the Tuesday morning continued as Tuesday mornings do, unremarked and ordinary and full of small important things. That evening, the palace released a brief statement announcing the honor. The announcement was understated in the way of things that do not need to make a case for themselves. It gave the formal name of the award, the formal language of the investiture, a single quote from the King's office describing the Princess of Wales's contribution to the royal family and to the nation as exceptional and sustained. It was 4 sentences long. The response was not 4 sentences. By midnight, the statement had been shared more than 2 million times. Messages poured in from people who had watched a video on a garden bench in March 2024 and had cried without knowing why. From people who had attended family hubs that Catherine had visited and had stood in corridors waiting for her to pass and had been stopped and asked about themselves instead. From parents who had watched her early years work and had, in the watching, felt that the thing they were doing every day, the exhausting, invisible, unremarkable work of raising a child, was being seen by someone with the standing to say publicly that it mattered. From women who had been diagnosed with cancer in the same year and had watched her video on a loop, not for comfort exactly, but for the specific necessary proof that it was possible to say the hard thing out loud and not be broken by the saying of it. From a 12-year-old girl in Sunderland who wrote, in a card she made herself and posted to Windsor Castle, that she had watched the garden video with her mom who was also sick and that the princess had made her mom feel less scared. The card arrived 3 weeks after she sent it. Catherine wrote back by hand. She always wrote back by hand. This was not widely known. It was not a policy that had been announced or a habit she had spoken about in interviews. It was simply what she did in the evenings after the children were in bed, at the kitchen table with a pen and the specific small pile of correspondence she set aside each week for personal replies. She could not reply to everything. No one could. But she replied to the letters she could not reply to, the ones from people standing in their own dark, looking for evidence that the dark was survivable. She wrote back to those. She had been doing it for years. The 44th year was ending now. Not in a single climactic moment, but in the way years end, gradually with the daily evidence of life continuing, the school runs and the homework and the suppers and the fires lit against the January cold coming around again. George was growing in increments that seemed suddenly too fast. Charlotte had asked a question at the dinner table last week that had stopped the conversation entirely, not because it was alarming, but because it was exactly the right question asked at exactly the right time in the voice of a girl becoming something. Lewis had decided, with the finality of the very young, that his current favorite color was not a color and was prepared to defend this position at length. Catherine sat with all of it, the ordinary dailiness and the extraordinary weight of a year that had been, by any measure, historic. She had been publicly honored in the most personal way the crown could honor someone. She had brought back from her illness not just her health, but a recalibrated understanding of what she was doing and why. She had sat on the floors of family hubs in Bradford and South London and Glasgow and looked at 2-year-olds explaining yellow trucks with the full attention of someone who understood, now more than ever, that the 2-year-old was the work. The 2-year-old was the whole point. History, in the public imagination, tends to be made of large gestures, speeches, treaties, battles, the moments that get dated and documented and placed in the clean narrative of retrospect. But the kind of history Catherine had made in her 44th year was not that kind. It was the kind that happens in the accumulation of small, consistent, genuine acts. The handshake that meant what it was supposed to mean, the question asked and remembered, the letter written by hand at the kitchen table the floor sat on, the video filmed in the garden on the worst possible day with a voice that didn't break. It was the kind of history that takes a long time to see and a long time to name. It does not announce itself. It does not require a stage. It only requires someone who is willing to keep showing up every day in the specific and irreplaceable way that only they can show up until the showing up has made something that was not there before. The Royal Victorian Order hung in its case in the drawer of the dressing table at Adelaide Cottage. Not on display, not framed, just there in the dark of the drawer, alongside the ordinary debris of a lived life. Receipts and hair ties and a photograph Lewis had drawn of the family in which everyone had very large heads, and Catherine had a crown that appeared to be on fire, which he had given her last Christmas, and which she had saved. She opened the drawer sometimes, not to look at the medal, to look at the drawing. She was a woman who knew what mattered. She had always known. The year just past had not taught her that. The year just past had simply confirmed, in the most visible way possible, that she had been right. She turned 45 in January with the same quietness she turned all her years. The children made breakfast. William brought coffee. Outside the window, the long walk was still bare, still patient, still absolutely certain that spring was coming. She was too.